Hi, this is a video intro to Chapter 18, and in particular we're going to be looking at a specific historian. This historian is a man named Frederick Jackson Turner. And Turner was a historian who, he had an idea about how to organize and reflect on American history that had a huge impact on America's perspective about itself. Turner presented his idea in 1893 in Chicago. And why that's important is this is just after the American frontier had officially been closed. And that's the idea that there was no longer a line in America beyond which there was no white settlement. So Jackson's idea was that this frontier, this area beyond which there were no civilized people living, and that's civilized with quotation marks, that had really impacted America. It had given Americans our distinctive character. It had given America its distinctive political system, and it really differentiated America from Europe. Now, part of this idea was based on the idea that the frontier worked as a safety valve. Anyone who was unhappy with the economic, social, or religious conditions in the East could head west into unclaimed, free land beyond the frontier. And Jackson's idea was that because of this, America had a certain amount of egalitarianism. Individualism was prized, and there was a lack of social stratification. The rich couldn't impose their will on the poor because the poor could simply vote with their feet. Also, America had a certain amount of violence on a very root level. Now, Jackson very explicitly claimed that America didn't have the kind of social violence that had been seen in Europe because of the frontier, but things like dueling had long been legal in the U.S., it was dying out by this time, but there was a certain amount of social violence that was accepted in the U.S. and much less in Europe. Also, he liked to point out that America had no high culture like Europe did. And here, pardon me, the idea is that Europe had a culture, a literary play, artistic culture that was for the rich and was really inaccessible to the common person. And the U.S. had a culture that was much more accessible to everyone. And again, he said that was because of the frontier bleeding off that creativity. People who wanted to do new things instead of going into arts would go to the frontier. Now, Turner's ideas were almost immediately challenged. And it's fair to say that within 50 years, they were largely abandoned. By the 1970s, for example, the frontier thesis was pretty much abandoned by most academics, but not all. And that means for 70 years, or almost 3 generations, this was an idea that motivated many Americans. It became really a part of American culture. It was included in the standard textbook, pardon me again, for teaching history. It was also reflected in many other studies from the early, mid, and even into the late 20th century. Studies of other cultures looking for a similar frontier abounded. It also had a lot of societal impacts. For example, you had Disney movies like Davy Crockett that told the story of tough individuals going out and by their own hard work making it on the frontier. And adult movies reflected this idea of individualism and the idea of the frontier as someplace where the rugged individual could make a name for themselves based on their own skill and their own grit. And these ideas had a political impact. In the 1930s, when the U.S. was going through one of its most problematic economic downturns, Franklin Delano Roosevelt and the New Dealers explicitly said they were looking for new frontiers in economics. Into the 1960s, JFK's New Frontier program explicitly used this frontier terminology. And going into the modern era, in economics, this idea of frontiers as a place where people are free to expand is still quite popular. The internet is often called the new frontier, quite literally calling back to Turner. And the fight to keep the internet free and unregulated, as embodied in the net neutrality movement, really calls back to this frontier thesis, and often in a very explicit way. People as diverse as Steve Jobs and Bill Gates have called the internet the new frontier. So, as you're reading chapter 18, keep in mind that that these myths about American frontier, and Turner is definitely a perspective on looking at the frontier, not necessarily a myth, but the Hollywood version of his ideas became a myth that, really dominated the American conversation for decades. And then in the 1960s and 70s, a reaction to that myth, which created its own, also inaccurate myth, also dominated the conversation. So, while you're reading, keep a lookout for those ideas, and I'll be hearing from you a little bit later.